Welcome to Gross Domestic Problem, the podcast that tackles America's biggest and most urgent crisis head on. The economy is on the brink. Americans feel it. But what if the real cause of the squeeze in their bank account, like an iceberg about to sink a ship, was mostly invisible? That iceberg? The national debt. Every episode of this show will be focused on unveiling this slow motion disaster. How do we get here? What happens if we don't get it under control? And what's the least painful way out? And what do we do in the meantime? There is no do-nothing solution, and every solution will require some sacrifice. But refusing that pain for ourselves means handing it on to the future with little to no control over who it hurts. And if you're like us, that's unacceptable. So let's dive in. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Gross Domestic Problem. I am absolutely thrilled. In some ways, when I conceived this show, this interview was the one that I wanted everyone to hear. We've had a lot of guests before Romina because we have to. The show must go on, and Romina's schedule's busy. So, but this is the one I've been most excited about. The national debt obviously is on a devastating and dangerous trajectory. And multiple times, thanks to Romina's influence, I have been in a room with people who are much smarter than I am, who are trying to figure out what to do about it. And in very short order, what becomes apparent is that good ideas, realistic good ideas that will make a difference on the debt and the deficit are not in short supply. What is in short supply, it seems, is the political will in our population to do something about it. And I have thought, I couldn't really imagine a better person for people to hear about this problem from than Romina. And the reason why is that the very first conversation I ever had with Romina, she suggested that I make a TV ad with Joe Biden holding a baby underwater while it drowned. And I thought, look, love it or hate it, this person is thinking about the immovability and the difficulty of getting the message of advocating for fiscal responsibility to a population that basically has a number of incentives to ignore the costs of that responsibility until it's much too late. So, Romina, thank you so much for joining me on this show. I'm really, really thrilled to have you. And most people who are here will know who you are already, or at least they'll know your name or they'll have read your work. But not many of us know the superhero origin story behind this work that you do. So tell us, what collection of good, bad decisions, good decisions, lost bets, failures, successes led you to the spot right now where you work on fiscal policy with Cato? How did this happen? What made you who you are?
Gosh, big question, William, to start off with. I just want to give a little bit of context to the story you shared about President Biden drowning the baby in the bathtub. That came as a response to attack ads against Paul Ryan's budget proposal.
Pushing grandma off the cliff.
That's right. And so my counter response to that was that we need to concern ourselves not just with preserving benefits for vulnerable seniors, which we can all agree on, or most of us can agree on.
Yeah.
But we also need to concern ourselves with the next generation,
right,
and the future of today's children and grandchildren. And that's where the message gets lost, because politicians have a tendency to bestow benefits on current constituents and pushing the bill off to future generations, in many cases that aren't yet able to vote or that aren't as active in politics. And so someone needs to look out for the children, is my point there.
Yes. So there is a rational and way less fun, boring version of this story where you were actually, speaking in a coherent political language. But it was way more fun my way. I just want to say I like my version of the story. But no, it's a good point. Obviously, I want to come back to letting people get to know you. But I think it's a good point to start with that ad. I think what the reason when you first told us you should make this ad, I knew that I was going to keep close to you for the entire time that I had an opportunity to do it. And the reason why is because I felt that you were taking seriously, and that's going to be a lot of what we talk about over the next 30 minutes or so, you took seriously that some of the interests involved in this discussion are completely aware that there is a zero-sum problem, and that they are willing to empty the clip to make sure that the burden doesn't fall on their people. And we're going to talk about what that is in a little bit. But I just think that it was such a realistic, it was awareness, a realistic demonstration of the political facts and the political realities here. And most people are frankly too kind, because whether or not we should have made that ad, what you were saying is these people are playing a very cynical game and we should play it too. And whether or not anyone agrees with that particular tactic, most people aren't willing to speak quite so frankly about the cynical game that the other side of this conversation is playing. So here you are as a person who totally gets realpolitik when it comes to fiscal responsibility. What made you the way that you are? How have you become this person? Maybe it should be a super villain origin story. Maybe that would be more fun. Like, because the villain's prerogative at the end is you have to tell the hero how they actually created you. Yes. by it's actually the Wayne family's like investment in toxic sludge that made me this villain that is about to take on Gotham, or whatever it is. What's your super villain origin story? How did you come to be the bane of the existence of special interest groups?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I was born in Germany and that I'm half Italian. So there's a political realism there and a bluntness and a willingness to speak the truth without couching it in a feedback sandwich that I think can be hard to find. And that's just the culture that I grew up in.
Sure.
Like, the German language is incredibly precise. It's a language for engineers, and so it makes you think very clearly and articulate yourself very clearly. People like to critique that there perhaps isn't as much nuance in German, but I think that can also be a benefit, especially when you're talking about the U.S. federal budget or really any economic topic, where I think being precise and clear is really important. But I had a very early childhood experience that made me question why it is that some countries and people prosper and others are stuck in poverty. And so it was that experience growing up in a relatively prosperous Germany and visiting my family in southern Italy and just seeing the difference in living standards across such a short distance, with my family members who moved from southern Italy to Germany having a lot more opportunity, incomes, higher living standards, all of that. So that's what got me into economics. So when I first came to the United States, it was as an exchange student initially. But I very quickly realized that this was a very special place and that I really enjoyed the energy and vibrancy of the United States. And it felt like a place where you could realize your dreams. I fundamentally believe in the American dream, and I have benefited from that greatly. And so I got into economics at George Mason University, just found myself in Washington, D.C., and got really excited about those issues. Most recently, I probably have one of the greatest honors of my life. We just celebrated the Milton Friedman Prize Dinner, which is an event that the Cato Institute puts on every 2 years. And we honored the legacy of Charles Koch, who's made great investments in the talent development pipeline and the liberty movement. And I was one of the benefactors of his investments. And I got to talk about that briefly in the video they put together to honor Charles Koch and his legacy. And so I was really lucky that I sort of stumbled into this network, did the Koch internship program and later the Koch associate program. And it was such a robust environment to really explore the ideas of liberty, what makes societies flourish, how you can establish the conditions for prosperity and growth. And fiscal policy, is the foundation for the economy. If you look at countries that have gone from being some of the most prosperous countries in the world, Argentina, Venezuela, that are no longer in that place, that have fallen from that peak towards a very deep trough. What many of these countries have in common is reckless spending policies that eventually result in their central banks financing the government spending by printing too much money, which creates inflation and distorts the important information signals and the incentives in the economy that are provided through a stable currency, through the pricing mechanism that allows individual actors to coordinate and to the benefit of each other and create these win-win situations. And so fiscal policy is the foundation of a vibrant, robust economy.
Right.
And that's why I'm focused on securing a more sustainable fiscal policy in the United States, because we have it so well. There's really an incredible thing going on in this country with entrepreneurship and innovation and the free market providing Americans with incredible living standards, especially compared to other countries. And we shouldn't take that for granted. Like, there is a real risk that we are going to kill that golden goose with a reckless government spending policy.
There's always the problem when you come late in any history. There's always the problem of thinking that the things that are yours by tremendous historical accident, which is to say, lots of things that have happened before could have gone differently. Lots of people could have made different decisions, and they made the decisions they made. And when you come late in the game, it's always very tempting to assume that the things that are that have happened to you by accident are somehow like fulfilling laws of nature. Nothing is as naive. Whatever people want to say about American exceptionalism, nothing is as naive as saying that Americans have it this way just because that's how it is, rather than Americans have it this way because at various points in our history, enough people have been persuaded of the relative goods of a free market, a financialized exchange, the ability to, for the most part, contract anything any way that you want. All of those things have been and all of those things are easy to underestimate just because we're so used to their benefits. And this, by the way, is, I think, just sort of the classic instance of the free rider problem, right? That we have this thing where we get the benefits of a thing that costs us almost nothing, and the costs are relatively invisible to us, and they were paid by people who came before us to a large extent. So here we are, thinking that, oh, this is just how it is. You wake up in the morning, you have all these choices, you have this ridiculous high standard of living, and you don't realize how precarious that is, especially in the whole sweep of human history. Again, you mentioned Argentina, and Venezuela. Venezuela sits on the highest density of valuable resources in the Western Hemisphere, and their people are starving. And it's like, okay, when you talk about the extreme case, everybody can acknowledge it, but nobody acknowledges the million paper cuts that get you there. How you can forfeit a massive historical home at field advantage just by not noticing the cost, what the actual costs of it are. So I think that's obviously well said that these are, and also it's such a cliche in a way, Romina, but it's a cliche that deserves mention because it is so commonly true. How native-born Americans forfeit this. They don't understand it. They don't recognize the gift that they have. Whereas like immigrants come here and immediately understand, like this. Because whether that's because of lived experience elsewhere or because just the fact of cultural crossing over a cultural boundary makes you realize how many things are unique. Whereas Americans think this is just what everyone does and we do it better. No. We do different things. And the reason Europe has 13 companies of a $10 billion market cap and the United States has 40 times that many is because we don't, or at least we haven't historically treated contracting and business as enemies of this of a good society, but as makers and stakeholders and important parts, constituent parts of a good society. So, if that's true, if this advantage can be lost, and as you said, looking at Argentina and Venezuela, and of course, like there's lots of others we could look at historically. England and many others, the Roman Empire, where bad fiscal policy can undermine a huge advantage. Why, Romina, in your view, is it so hard for politically for good fiscal policy to find an advocate? Why doesn't that happen?
We had advocates in the past. It wasn't that long ago that you had Paul Ryan, for example, was one of the most articulate and principled spokespersons on putting the budget on a path to balance and putting forth concrete proposals such as introducing more market forces into Medicare, which is the primary driver of our fiscal crisis, is U.S. government healthcare spending and the way that this is administered. And he even ran on a presidential platform with that agenda.
Right.
But he lost. And he was dragged through the mud for his ideas. Like we previously mentioned, the attack ad of pushing grandma off the cliff, which was incredibly dishonest. But we live in an environment, politics benefits from scaring people, spreading misinformation, and it has a huge impact.
Yeah.
And so it hasn't been politically profitable for people like Paul Ryan to be principled and put forth the tough medicine that we're confronted with. The issue we have is that in politics, what sells is if you give people immediate benefits and you don't confront them with the cost. It's really a problem of free lunch economics, where you pretend like you have the ability to just give stuff away and it doesn't cost anything, or if it costs something, it's going to cost someone else and you don't need to worry about those people.
Yes.
This whole idea of we can just tax the rich and make all of our fiscal problems go away, which is absolutely untrue. There just isn't enough money at the very top end, but you keep seeing these political lies because they sell and they're convenient. And so it's really a question of either how can you get politicians to show the courage to do what's economically necessary but politically difficult, or perhaps more importantly, recognize that our political system is not set up to solve really tough problems like having locked in automatic spending increases for very popular benefit programs that are shrouded in popular myths about earned benefits and you're just getting back what you paid in. I'm talking specifically about the major old age entitlements, Social Security and Medicare in this case. We don't know how to fix those problems, right? And so maybe the answer doesn't lie in voting the right people into office, because we've tried that and those people also fail. Paul Ryan, again, being the model example. But maybe you need a different solution that recognizes the challenges that our political process poses for solving these kinds of problems, and then looks at what else could work here. And that's what I've been trying to do, is think really creatively and in an entrepreneurial fashion about how can we overcome these political barriers to solving our fiscal crisis before it undermines American freedom and prosperity.
Yes, and I'm so glad that you said all this. I really want to get to this discussion about the new ways that you've thought about how we might go about solving the fiscal crisis that is surely on its way. But really, I just want to take one more step before we get there and talk about because the plausibility of the solution depends on the differences in the grasp of the problem. So you've as you said, and I just want to sort of dwell on the problem for another minute here. You've said voting the right people in office won't do. It's hard to imagine, especially in your view. But I think, even if you were to look back, well, it's hard to imagine a better advocate for a responsible fiscal path than Paul Ryan. agree, disagree about the mix of, tax raises and benefit cuts and everything else. Like, however, lots of people could get into the weeds there and disagree. The guy risked his entire political career on the question of fiscal stability, and the enemies he made in politics were enemies he made in defense of the fiscal stability of the country. So there was a time when Paul Ryan was in office, a commission had been impaneled, a congressional commission had been impaneled to review and study the problem of the fiscal unsustainability of the country. And by the way, at that time, I believe we had less than half of our current national debt at that time. And so that commission being the Simpson-Bowles Commission, they made recommendations to a president who had committed ahead of time to take those recommendations at least far more seriously than it seems like in the end they were taken. And then at the end, the commission made recommendations that were not only more or less rejected by the president, they were explicitly rejected by Paul Ryan. So the point being, this is all to say, the standard political process was either the process was wrong or the people were wrong. And it seems like if the people were wrong, we're in trouble because you don't have anybody else. Like, there's no one currently on the scene and no one since Paul Ryan who has demonstrated that level of awareness of the problem and who frankly had that erudite understanding of the levers of the problem, let alone a sympathetic president from an alternate part from the other party who was willing, at least it seemed, was willing to deal. Those things aren't anywhere to be found. So if those people can't get it done, who can get it done? Your answer is the people aren't the problem. The politics are the problem. And that part of the political problem is that the costs, as long as you can shift the costs to people who aren't here to complain about having to pay them, then you raise the cost of resisting to an untenable degree for anyone now, right? If I'm saying, look, here's $80,000 for you, Romina, to do whatever you want with, and don't worry about the cost of it. We're shifting that to somebody else in the account book. And then Romina's friend, who understands that shifting isn't real, raises her voice to say, don't take that $80,000. You, Romina, say, are you actually my friend? That's the political situation. Because now you have advocacy groups who say, you just hate old people. You want to push grandma off the cliff. That's the problem, right? Because the people who have to pay the costs aren't here to complain about it. So the cost of advocating for those people, when the benefits are right now and the costs are tomorrow, is too high. That, I think, is just if that's the issue, there is no person solution as a politics solution. What we have to do is rearrange the incentives politically for people to make the difficult choice of saying, even though this benefit is today, and even though this cost is tomorrow, somebody has to think about tomorrow. And it has to be somebody's job. They have to be incentivized on doing it well. Now, having said that, I've now, I'd love to just now say, so talk us through, given that awareness of the problem, the entrepreneurial idea that you have for re-incentivizing the right kind of political action.
Yeah. If you look at other countries that have solved fiscal crises before, because there are examples of this. Sweden comes to mind, Germany, Switzerland, all of which have a different mix of spending and taxes, but what they have in common is that they figured out how to prevent the runaway deficit spending that we're suffering from now. And this is a problem that the late Nobel Prize-winning economist Jim Buchanan identified in very plain English a long time ago when he talked about the propensity for democracies to go into deficit because exactly of the calculus that you just described. And what Jim Buchanan called for is a constitutional restraint that you have to impose that artificial top layer limit to prevent politicians from doing what they otherwise would be doing. If we think of the analogy with alcoholism, it's for many people what works well is if they specifically limit themselves to say 1 drink or 2 drinks and I won't go beyond that. Or for some people it has to be no drink at all, because once they get started they can't stop. And this is sort of the idea, is that you have to impose an external constraint. Or if you think about diet or nutrition, you could say, I'm only going to eat 1 cookie. I'm not going to eat 10 cookies. I'm not going to eat the whole bag of Oreos. I'm just going to have 2 cookies. And it's this kind of restraint that Switzerland, Germany, and Sweden have imposed.
Right.
They have so-called debt breaks. Now, that doesn't get you the reforms to actually live within your budget. That enshrines a commitment to keeping your budget relatively balanced, sustainable over time, to only go into deficit and debt spending when you are working through a crisis where you need to temporarily loosen that debt limit or fiscal restraint to help you get through the crisis, like, say, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
But then you should be paying down those deficits and debts that you incurred when your economy is booming again. And that's where the United States has fallen short. We've basically run massive deficits during crises. And then we've continued to run deficits during economically strong times. And now the problem is that more than 3/4 of the budget is on autopilot. It's spending on interest on the debt, spending on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, the big entitlement programs, plus what we're paying on our debt, which Congress doesn't even have to vote on an annual basis. And You're basically asking politicians to fix a problem that was put in place decades ago by other politicians who reaped the political benefits from putting in place these programs with their very generous structures. And now you're asking current politicians to take the political hit for fixing problems that they didn't even create. So it's a really difficult situation. And so how do you get those reforms in place? Well, I like to think that, I like to refer to what Milton Friedman said, is that you have to make it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. You have to change the incentives. On this issue, this is particularly difficult, but we do have an example where the United States system was able to overcome a similar, although much smaller, intractable problem, which was after the Cold War, the U.S. had all of these obsolete military bases. No member of Congress could afford to politically advocate for having a base closed in their district. There would be immediate pain to the people affected. Jobs would be lost. The infrastructure, would have to be refurbished for new uses. And who reaped those benefits? Well, the benefits were dispersed across the entire country, right? We all benefit from not wasting money on obsolete military bases. So it was this problem, and politicians realized that the only way that they were going to solve this was by delegating the responsibility to an independent commission of not elected officials, so that Congress had the political cover to do what made sense, but was going to cause some short-term political pain and be unpopular until people realized the benefits over the long term. Because, by the way, if you look at the Base Realignment and Closure process and what happened after those military bases were closed, in most cases, those areas flourished. That infrastructure was put to new commercial uses. It created higher paying jobs, more sustainable jobs that weren't so dependent on government largesse. So there was a long-term gain, but you had to get through that short-term pain. And so the Base Realignment and Closure Commission basically set up a mechanism where Congress specified the goals they were trying to accomplish: close obsolete military bases, save money doing so. But instead of Congress having to specify which bases would be closed, etc., and then also having to vote on it, they delegated that responsibility to an independent commission, asking them to follow those guidelines, put forth a plan. And the genius thing was, and this is where Simpson-Bowles failed, members of Congress never had to vote on the Base Realignment and Closure plan for the military bases to actually be closed. It was a default acceptance mechanism. Once Congress set in motion the independent commission, and so for so long as the independent commission stayed within the guidelines that Congress has provided for what they should accomplish, then their proposal would go to Congress, and Congress never had to vote on it. Sort of a shot clock would start for 45 days. And if Congress didn't explicitly reject the commission plan, it would automatically go into effect. So that created a political dynamism where members of Congress could vehemently defend the bases in their district, which they had to do for their constituents, but without ultimately undermining the success of the commission proposal. If they had to take that vote, I doubt that we probably still have those obsolete military bases to this day and be spending maybe $1 trillion trying to keep them running.
So I guess a number of questions about this, because obviously this isn't the first time you and I have spoken about this, but I think a lot of people will be hearing this for the first time. I guess, so let me just ask some questions that might be dumb questions. So first of all, how do you compare, or in your mind, how would you, so obviously the question of which Cold War bases to close was contentious, and every dollar that the government spends has a constituency that is highly motivated to keep that dollar being spent. But how do you feel like the level of special interest investment stacks up? For example, comparing like the military bases versus, say, Social Security and Medicare, which, as you said, are kind of like our biggest. These are the poison pills in the federal budget now. It seems to me, and I might be wrong about this, but it seems to me that the AARP is bigger, more dangerous, more politically scary than any of the special interests that would have been arrayed on behalf of keeping military bases open. All of those interests would be rather local. They would be, district by district. And unless those guys then like organize nationally on a scale to keep all the bases open, it'd be hard to compare their power and their level of influence with AARP. And I guess the reason I guess my question is a BRAC-style commission for the federal budget and for the debt and deficit, is that actually politically feasible given the power of the interests who would be arrayed against it? I don't imagine the AARP would let you get off with saying something like, well, they didn't actively vote against it. Like, I don't think that they would allow that. I think they would absolutely make ads of people pushing grandma off a cliff just because they didn't actively vote against the commission. Right? Is that so? What would you say? And I don't mean that as a gotcha. I just really want people to be able to think about what's actually at stake in this idea. What would you say is the likelihood that the incentives you want politically would actually be there, given the power of the interests lined up against it?
Yeah. So I actually had a conversation with Paul Ryan about this very problem. He asked a very similar question. And I think you probably still need more political cover than Congress just introducing a commission like this, let's say right now. You could do it at a time when it looks like the bond markets are already pushing the government to show more fiscal restraint. I also thought that the high inflation following the COVID-19 pandemic created such an opportunity because people were feeling the pain every time they went to the grocery store. And so you could frame the effort around, we are going to fix the spending crisis that is driving up inflation. Yeah. So I think you still need a political mechanism that puts pressure and therefore gives political cover for Congress to do the right thing here. The debt limit is another potential opportunity that you could use as that leverage point to get something like this across the finish line. And once Congress has authorized the BRAC Commission, now it basically leans into what Congress does so well, which is put programs on autopilot, except in this case, you would actually have a fiscal restraint commission.
Fiscal restraint on autopilot. Right.
Yeah, versus the spending growth on autopilot, which is what we have right now. So you're not going to get around the problem that, yes, we have elected officials, and the whole point of that is so the American people can hold them accountable. But I do think it is a mechanism that gets you the potential to enact those solutions that otherwise might not be enacted at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the idea is that a BRAC-style commission, in your view, might be a necessary element to put the U.S. on a more sustainable fiscal path, but it might not be sufficient. Just because there would need to be additional political movers of some kind to restrain the influence of the special interests that are arrayed against it.
Yeah, I mean, we had a perfect example last January. The House Budget Committee passed the Fiscal Stability Act. You had a companion bill in the Senate. You had, I think, about 60 bipartisan lawmakers that were behind that effort. It passed the House Budget Committee on a bipartisan vote. It seemed like things were on track to not get a full BRAC-style commission, but get a fiscal commission that had a combination of elected officials and independent experts to give Congress more cover and also the expertise, and had a good goal. Stabilize the debt at no more than 100% of the U.S. economy over the next 15 years. So you have a smooth glide path where you don't have to make radical changes, but you do have to start moving in the right direction. And also give the Commission credit for making long-term changes to Medicare and Social Security that improve the solvency of their trust funds. Because in that case, there are changes where you might not get big savings in like a 10 or 15-year budget window, but over a 50-year period, you could see significant, like raising the retirement age, for example. And so you had that commission. Why did that not move to the House floor? Because once these special interest groups caught on that there was a serious effort that had bipartisan support to actually slaughter some sacred cows, whatever your sacred cow is, whether it's that you want to increase Medicare and Social Security benefits, like some of these groups on the left, AARP being one example, but also more radical groups, like the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, for example. Or you also had groups on the right that thought any grand bargain will inevitably result in some kind of a tax increase, because that's what it takes to make political compromise. And so you had Americans for Tax Reform on the other side object to the commission and basically threaten people who were running for re-election, which, if you recall, we were in an election here last year, that they were going to come after them for paving the way for a Republican tax increase. Where I disagree with Americans for Tax Reform on that strategy is that they don't seem to acknowledge that deficits today are just delayed taxation tomorrow.
Of course.
They don't go up against the deficit spending that we have, even though it's basically just future taxation. And the issue is that they may still get their way, that the government won't tax people directly, but they will tax us indirectly. And that is called inflation. And they completely overlook that. And so you had groups on the right and left opposing the commission, and it didn't go anywhere. And it is on ice. And then President Trump came into office, and he's been more focused on giving away more populist handouts, including handouts for the very populations that are already getting the bulk of the federal spending benefits. The population 65 and older benefit from about 40% of the entire federal government budget is dedicated to providing benefits. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are the big ones, and there's some others, to people who are 65 and older, who, by the way, happen to be the wealthiest generation in U.S. history. So you have government redistribution from working Americans trying to get by, put their kids through school, pay off their car loans, maybe get a house if they're lucky, although with today's interest rates, that is becoming out of reach for many people. And the government taking thousands upon thousands of dollars from them every year. Like, by the way, someone earning $60,000 a year, which is not that much money, is that's the median wage in the United States. That person pays over $7,500 a year just for Social Security. You haven't added Medicare, you haven't added income taxes, just for Social Security. And that money goes to some of the wealthiest people in our nation. Also, by the way, a lot of people don't realize this, but the maximum Social Security benefit, which is collected by the wealthiest, highest earning Americans, is equivalent to the median wage in the United States. Did you know that? A wealthy person that is part of Social Security can collect more than $60,000 a year in Social Security benefits, and then you still have Medicare, etc. That median wage earner has to pay his health care out of that amount. So it is absolutely insane. And so, unfortunately, President Trump wants to give even more money to the 65 and older population because it's politically popular. They vote. They're a very powerful constituency.
Yes, they're here for one thing, and most of the people who are going to pay for that those choices, if they are voting age, they're not engaged. So that's one problem, and then many of them just aren't here yet. They're the people who are going to inherit the generational fiscal collapse that's coming. So the last 10 minutes or so, I think you've made an able defense. Like these are the things that folks ought to be saying to the special interests, and saying to their constituencies and reminding them, of what is really at stake. What would you say then to, another objection a person could imagine making to the idea of a BRAC-style commission is that actually, what would you say to someone who says what you're doing is actually giving Congress a chance to get off the hook for being Congress? I mean, Article 1 says we want this elected body of representatives to make the fiscal situation of the country whatever it's going to be. They're the ones who have the authority to levy taxes. They're the ones who have the authority to authorize government spending. They're the ones we put in place to do it. And what this idea is an idea to get that decision, which is the only freaking reason we have them, off of their plate. What would you say to that objection? It might be sort of like this is outside of regular order, but you could imagine a more intense version of the objection. Forget regular order. This is why there's a Congress. So why do we have a Congress if what we impanel Congress to do, or what we elect Congress to do, is to impanel other people to do their job for them?
Yes, that is a very valid critique. And in an ideal world, Congress will make the tough decisions and find the bipartisan compromise to make those decisions itself. But the question we're confronted with is, are we going to put in place a workable mechanism that realigns the social contract, which right now is take as much money from younger generations as possible and shovel it as quickly as you can to the older generation, regardless of need and regardless of the younger generation's ability to finance those commitments. Or rely on the government devaluing our currency and potentially upending global dollar dominance through inflation. Because that is the default that Congress will follow. They will not make the tough political choices. They will just put it on the Federal Reserve to get us out of this. And we have ample examples of this in U.S. history and global history, where the Federal Reserve ends up, in order to fulfill its mandate, financing government spending by issuing new money, and then we pay for it through inflation. And that's what I'm trying to avoid. It's sort of like worst case scenario. We just destroy our currency. Best case scenario, Congress makes the politically tough choices, but they don't seem to be capable of doing that. And we've tried it so many ways. And so, the better scenario than upending our entire economic structure, in this case, to me, is empowering an independent commission to do what Congress knows needs to be done, but they're not willing of doing.
exactly right. I think one of
It's
the
a second best option.
yes, that's right. Exactly. Your reply is, well, look, yeah, if Congress would be Congress, then great. But if they won't, and more importantly, not just if they won't. In other words, you're not making just a moral argument about the fecklessness of congressional leaders. In fact, I think you can see that, like, even that right now, resident in Congress, you and I could name 25 to 30 people off the top of our head without working too hard, who we think are as good as you could possibly hope for from a fiscal sustainability standpoint. And the question is not like, well, how do we get better how do we get better congressmen and congresswomen? It's how do we, like, what forces are, how do we realistically evaluate what is arrayed against them doing their job? Is it simply a sort of lack of courage or some sort of moral failure, or is it the fact that actually there's a species of collective action problem at play here that makes it so that, like, that the thing we need Congress to do is the thing that actually they can't do and still be Congress. Like, it's like right. It's a suicidal mission. It really freaking is. And it's all well and good to say, well, Congress should all go kamikaze on the budget. But then the only thing that's going to happen is people who are less scrupulous, who are more willing to do the terrible thing, are going to be are going to be the ones who replace them. So I think what you've been saying for 2 years on this question is you're questioning the realism, I think, in a way that's profound, of people who would say that this is a job for Congress to do. Now, like, good people could disagree about that. Obviously, they do. But the point is, you're saying, you're not, by a tweak here and a nip and a tuck there, going to fundamentally rearrange the political contract that currently exists between Congress, the people who vote for them, and the rest of the people who are citizens of this country, but not as engaged because they don't have the same incentives to be engaged. You can't, we can't rock the vote enough people into the political system to change this calculus. At least we can't do it probably in time. So your question is, like, what's a realistic solution? Here's mine, you said. Maybe it's not the best one, given that, like, it would be better if Article 1 could just, if people could just look at Article 1 and do their jobs. But precisely because of the way that our system has empowered small groups with big incentives, it's actually just really much more difficult for Congress to do that job than maybe we would wish.
And it's getting more difficult over time because the population that primarily benefits from the current redistribution scheme is growing in size.
Yeah.
As a share of our population, and therefore also in their political power.
Right.
And so it's only going to get more difficult. And there is no fail-safe mechanism built into the system that prevents a country from destroying itself. Yeah. We have ample examples in history of countries, primarily through this type of irresponsible fiscal policy that provides current benefits at the cost of future generations, without, by the way, making the number necessary of future generations, because that's another cost issue, right?
Right.
Is and we've seen fertility declines as a result of that. There's no fail-safe mechanism, so we have to put one in place if we want to prevent this self-sabotaging behavior that we're currently witnessing, because the United States is unlikely to be destroyed by a foreign enemy. It is more likely to undermine its own strength. And we've seen examples of this under the current president, following populist and misleading beliefs about how imposing massive tariffs will make the United States stronger, when all of the evidence points in the direction of actually erecting all these trade barriers makes the United States a lot weaker, both economically and in terms of our ability to exert global power, which, by the way, is a way that we make ourselves safer. And so it's in this battle of ideas where the best ideas and the most sustainable ideas don't necessarily win out, because the marketplace of ideas doesn't work like the marketplace of goods and services. And so I'm trying to be politically realistic here, keeping in mind my bigger goal of how do we turn this ship around before this Titanic crashes into the iceberg.
Right. One of you, as I said, I warned you that we would only go over time if you kept saying interesting things, which you did. So, but I just want to pause for a second and just say, this thing that you're describing about the United States' likely demise, or I mean, what, in other words, if the United States undergoes a demise, what would likely cause it? It is so. I mean, there was a time when nobody could see the end of the British Empire, and it's what's interesting is the British Empire spent in peacetime in such a way that when war came, as it often does, the debts of the war compromised the British Empire. Like, war debt is really what killed the empire. We are spending, it has to be said. I mean, this is what you mentioned this earlier, because our spending is on autopilot and because of the way the incentives work, what happens is we create deficits in emergencies and then they stay. Like nobody could have ever imagined what our deficit spending would be in response to a thing like the COVID pandemic. And then those deficits are now here and the pandemic is gone. And we're still spending like we're in pandemic. We're spending like we're in crisis. We're spending like we're in war in peacetime with, the recent shocks notwithstanding, relatively a good economic situation. When the crisis, whatever it is, comes, whether it's another pandemic or whether it's, some sort of global conflict that happens that we have to respond to, whatever these things are, we will either retreat from the world stage or we will have to spend a ton of money to stay on the world stage. And in either case, right, that's the thing, is like in either case, we're fundamentally weakened afterwards. Right? We're weakened by the retreat, which seems to be the path that current leadership is advocating for, economically, militarily, sort of like a withdrawal from the world. Mm-hmm. Or if we choose the other way, we have to subsidize it somehow, and we're in trouble there too. So
we're already in trouble because with U.S. debt at 100% of GDP, we are actively dragging down our economy's potential to create jobs, to create growth, to create life-saving and life-improving innovations. You are already seeing federal government borrowing crowding out private sector investments today. This is no longer a future problem. We're not in an acute fiscal crisis right now where the government cannot honor all of its obligations because we're still able to issue debt. And so we're dependent on a lot of foreigners, in this case, buying U.S. government debt to be able to continue to finance these obligations. And we're still lucky in the sense that they're still willing to buy our debt. But that is also not something we can take for granted. And given this administration's erratic actions on the global stage, it is actively undermining credibility in the United States dollar, in our willingness to be a credible and reliable global actor. And we have seen that play out in the bond markets already with interest rates going up. And so we're in a very precarious state right now because we're undermining our own economy's ability to supply the resources that the government wants to spend and wants to redistribute because our debt is so high and we're crowding out that private sector investment, which will mean less growth in the future, fewer opportunities for people to get ahead, lower wages for American workers. And that's a problem of today. That's now. That's not tomorrow. The tomorrow problem could be that acute fiscal crisis where the government is forced to make sudden, severe spending cuts, and they would likely also try to find money by raising taxes and just grabbing it from wherever they can in order to make the math work. And likely relying on our central bank to float a lot of that currency and pay for it through inflation. That's the acute fiscal crisis, but we're already in a debt crisis today.
You mentioned the foreign actors, and of course it's worth mentioning that, the current administration's foreign trade policy has definitely affected the willingness of foreign actors to hold U.S. debt. They're divesting, but they already were divesting, it's worth saying. Like, there already was a slower, less acute trend of divestment, at least from say, Japan and China, who are already getting rid of our debt. So it's the scenario you're describing is one where when foreign actors, whether sympathetic or antipathetic to us, decide to divest themselves from our debt, then not only is the economy that the crowded out economy unable to provide the resources, it's also the primary source of investors willing to float the debt, and they're going to lose willingness to do it as well. So I guess we're in a place where in my mind, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong about this, but in my mind, a failed Treasury auction is a possibility tomorrow, next week. 2 months from now. I mean, the point is, the problem politically of the national debt is that it's an issue that people have been pointing out for so long, but the consequences have never arrived. Or at least they've never arrived in the way that people warned. But we're in a situation where, it's different from 2010 because we're definitely not in a period. We're not entering a period of historically low interest rates. Quite the opposite. And the willingness of, just the space in investor portfolios to support U.S. debt isn't there like it was in 2010. It is. It was there then. They could float it. That created the low interest rate environment. We don't have that now. So nobody can possibly say. But the thing is, it is not, to me, to be taken for granted that a crisis is coming somewhere down the way. It could happen next week. If there's a failed Treasury auction, it seems to me that the economic ripple effect of a failed Treasury auction would be devastating, relatively immediate, and the threat to dollar supremacy and to U.S. economic supremacy and the U.S. economic stability would be pretty immediate in the case of something like that. And I just don't see, I don't see why that can't happen. That's, I guess the question is there's nothing in my mind preventing investors from tomorrow just saying, nope, you got to raise it 3 points before I'll touch it. Why wouldn't they?
The situation we're in is kind of like you have a severely obese patient with diabetes, and they're telling you that they'll start fixing their diet and exercising after they have their heart attack. That's what we're doing right now, is basically Congress saying, we'll work on the fiscal crisis when the fiscal crisis is here. And what we've been trying to say as outside experts is it's too late. You need to start exercising and dieting now to avoid the heart attack. To your point, why wouldn't this happen tomorrow? It could happen tomorrow. The only saving grace is that there doesn't seem to be at this time a reliable alternative to U.S. Treasury bonds and the U.S. dollar. But that is not a scenario that will always be the case, because that used to be said about the British pound. And is no longer.
Exactly right.
And as you said, that there is already there are various movements of divesting from the U.S. dollar and Treasury bonds underway for economic and national security reasons. Also, global bondholders are well aware of our unsustainable fiscal situation. And so we're currently in a holding pattern where basically everyone knows this cannot go on forever. But they're not people aren't slowly jumping off for the most part. When they do, it'll be everyone all at once.
Yes.
And so this is the heart attack I'm talking about that we're trying to avoid. But on the current trajectory, Congress seems to be willing to have the heart attack first before they consider any changes.
Goodness gracious. Yeah. So, I mean, I think your point is that desperate times call for desperate measures, and a BRAC commission, yes, maybe it short circuits Congress, but my goodness, we don't have time in your mind to take 20 years to do it. And maybe part of the perspective that's giving that you're furnished with is the perspective of having seen, what has become of some of the old world heavy players who now are shadows of their former selves, whether that's England or Italy. I mean, Germany is a counterexample, precisely as you say, because of embracing fiscal responsibility before the heart attack. Romina, thank you so much for being here. It's always such a joy to talk to you. Maybe we should, maybe you're right. Maybe we should make that ad of the poor drowning baby, because it sounds like what you're saying is we may not know it yet, but we're drowning.
Yeah, and it's not the baby. It's got to be our generation at this point.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much for being here. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you always.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to subscribe to the show. Want to dig deeper? Follow us at millennialdebt.org for more insights, updates, and ways to be part of the solution. Thanks for listening.